Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-episode series brought to you with underwriting from Taylor and Francis, we're talking about how academic libraries can demonstrate value to campus administrators. As we know, the digital transformation, the rise of accountability and assessment, austerity measures after the 2008 market crash, and the evolving scholarly communication landscape have all contributed to a more unified strategic orientation and departmental accountability across campus. The publication of ACRL's Standards for Libraries in Higher Education in the fall of 2011 addresses this shift with practical guidance, and yet many libraries have more work to do to be seen as valued partners in their institutions. Joining me to discuss the whys and hows of a robust value proposition are Hilary Craiglow, Library Consulting Practice Lead at Attain Partners, Dr. Jeffrey Gold, President of the University of Nebraska System, and Emily McElroy, Vice President of Academic Relations at Taylor and Francis. But before we get started, if you want to keep up on the latest programming from the Authority File, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter for information on the current and previous month's episodes. To subscribe, simply visit choice360.org, click on the newsletter sign-up banner in the top right corner, and select the Choice Podcast Updates option. While you're there, you can also sign up for other newsletters published by Choice. In this second episode of our series, we look more closely at the nuts and bolts of aligning a mission with campus leadership, including the hallmarks of a strong relationship and the specific benchmarks, stories, and metrics that administrators are looking for. Okay, so let's look a little bit more closely at how the library can align its mission with administration. So, Hilary, I'm going to start with you on this. When you're counseling libraries on this topic, where do you usually start? Understanding this is not a one-size-fits-all approach, but what are some of the general pain points that you see?
Yeah, I'd like to riff a little bit on what Jeff said, if that's okay, to try and answer this question. I think some of the concepts that are gaining traction are on measurable return on university investments. So real dollars, real data metrics. So when libraries present data showing that, say, their research support services helped faculty secure X dollar amount in new grants at a low personnel cost, that will create a very compelling return ratio. Similarly, demonstrating that library-led student success initiatives improve retention rates with a specific percentage of retention, or translating to X retained tuition revenue or satisfaction scores. Those kinds of things speak directly to these bottom line concerns. Mm-hmm. These are super challenging metrics to create, especially doing it in isolation. So what is most effective is working across the campus to develop metrics through very deep campus partnerships, student affairs, research grants, data analytics office, and developing some shared metrics because we are a cost center. As Jeff was saying, we're not really bringing in revenue unless you're looking at development funds. So developing some of these shared metrics creates a compelling narrative, but it also demonstrates the library's centrality to the mission and the value proposition. What else can I say about that? The other thing I think I just want to talk about a little bit is what really seems to resonate as I'm working with universities is coupling these very specific return on investment type metrics with a narrative, testimonial, a persona that will make a more colorful and memorable story that resonates and makes a lasting impression.
Excellent. Yeah, I don't. In many cases, I don't think we're asking folks to abandon, certain traditional services. I think some of what we're talking about here is just being able to tell the right story that behind those services in order to connect what the library is doing with the overall mission of the institution.
And if I may, it's the overall story, but it's also the priorities within the context of those priorities, within the context of the value proposition, what keeps people like Jeff up at night.
Exactly. Okay. Um, what are, or would you say, are the hallmarks, of a strong relationship between the library and campus leaders? It's a partnership that goes two ways. While libraries need a seat at the table, they also need to move away from simply defending budgets to providing solutions like we've talked about. But, in your experience, what are some of the other, stronger elements of, a really conducive relationship between the library and campus?
I think it does go back to just basic communications 101,
Hmm. Hmm.
listening, um, avoiding defensiveness. I think the thing to always keep in mind is that the best outcome of building these relationships is that you're developing a coalition of support. And libraries cannot advocate effectively in isolation. They need the partnerships with the faculty or the students, administrators, alumni, and community who can speak to the library value from their own perspectives. And I think that when I have been at the table, a lot of it is listening to what everyone's talking about in terms of their issues, their priorities, and then figuring out how the library can support them.
Mm.
um, a couple of just I like to give examples of some of these things. When at one institution, I took on a role as a primary liaison to a research office, and I was warmly welcomed. Don't get me wrong, but I sensed just some tension, and I suspected it was because the libraries were seen as a recurring expense for collections. And while that was true, we also had moved ahead and offered an expanded range of services for researchers that had been developing over time, certainly before I arrived. And this goes to what Jeff was saying earlier about data services and things like that. And what it was is we weren't effectively telling our story because no one really knew what we were doing to help those early career researchers and other things. And so part of that is once we started doing that, then all of a sudden it opened up to, oh, okay, well, we want to move forward on different policies and we really want you to be at the table to participate in those conversations and the
Mm.
implementation of that. And so that was something that allowed everyone to grow. And then I think another example, just kind of thinking about the collections people who might be listening to this, is when I was in Nebraska. This is something that a lot of academic health science librarians hear is that people want access to your collections, especially clinical partners who may not be able to license them through you. So this is a very practical example. But this was something that caused a lot of people frustration. And instead of trying to get defensive as to why we couldn't do this, what we ended up doing was just really mapping out lots of possible solutions. And one of them was that we licensed the content that they chose, we managed those resources, and then we built on top of that customized reference and instruction. And it worked great. It benefited our faculty and students who worked with these groups during their clinical rotations or as research partners. And for them, they were able to afford access to things that were the most important. And so, what we really had to do is we had to present facts about why we couldn't do something, but here's an alternative, and let's be creative about how it's funded. And we also kept a lot of quantitative and qualitative data that contributed to just ongoing renewals of those arrangements. So we moved beyond a pain point to something that I think is still a strong partnership.
Hmm. Hillary, I think some of what Emily's saying ties back to something you said, which is, the libraries can be looking across campus for partnership opportunities with other departments. And it sounds like that's kind of a good tie in to those examples Emily was just sharing.
Totally agree. When library leaders can position their services as solutions to those campus challenges rather than offering general benefits or asking for something in return, I think
Mm.
those libraries are very successful.
Hmm. Excellent. Um, Jeff, I wanted to come back to you, maybe getting a little bit more specific on, some of the things that you might be looking for from library representatives in terms of, you know, the elements that tell a successful story? What kind of metrics are you looking for? What specifics or quote unquote sound bites do you need, to hear from library leaders? What should they be prioritizing?
Yeah, great question. I'm, a recovering engineer and have been very data driven for a long time. I understand that not everything that you measure is important and that not everything that's important can be measured, but there is a tendency to try to put numbers and trend analysis together over time to make difficult decisions, particularly if you're trying to justify some hard decision making. So we have a number of metrics that cut across the entire University of Nebraska system, well over 100 that are siloed into 5 different what we call foundational pillars. Just to list them off in order, they would be the educational learning pillar, the research and creative activity pillar, the partnerships and relationships and engagement pillar, the campus culture and safety pillar, and then finally the financial stewardship and efficiency pillars. And each of those has, any number of metrics that go along with it that each of our academic units, our multiple campuses, business units, administrative units, all of our athletic departments, of which we participate in 4 different athletic conferences, are responsible for more or less their share of those pillars. And the libraries individually on each of our campuses have their set of responsibilities that are directly connected within those pillars. So let's take partnerships for an example. They can be inwardly facing. What are we doing with colleges, departments? Is there participation of library staff in research programs with, very intense research productive groups and in specific colleges, think medicine, engineering, and, others. And then there are the outward facing ones. For instance, does the library have a relationship with the local bar association, the local medical association? Does the library have a relationship with certain cohorts of alumni? I think Emily was referring to that just a few minutes ago. Or, every university has any number of adjunct, part-time, and non-paid preceptors. And how do we find a way to say thank you to them and giving them access to library services is, I have found to be an extremely powerful tool of creating value. While it may not show directly to the bottom line of having relationships, but if it enhances your, alignment and your engagement of your alumni base, if it happens to enhance the relationship with community preceptors, that results in a better experience for your learners or reduces your cost of having to pay full-time or part-time faculty, there's a huge amount of relationship that is gained there. So again, quantifiable metrics that can be expressed in both direct and indirect gain for the university.
Excellent. Hillary and Emily, I wanted to just pitch something back to you real quick. The pillars that Jeff was mentioning, do libraries tend to be included in that, in those requirements, or
they sure as heck are here, I can tell you.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm wondering if that's a common thing across different types of campuses, different types of institutions, or if they're asked to provide that kind of information as other campus departments are.
I heard someone say once, if you've seen one university library, you've seen one university library. I think there is no commonality there. It is definitely a mixed bag. Those that get the seat that Jeff's talking about are more successful. And when you start to get deaths by 1,000 cuts, however, and libraries begin to get marginalized, it does become a little bit of a spiral. So once you lose that seat at the table, it's hard to build back unless we go back to that culture change, leadership change. So in any case, there is no one answer from my perspective. There are so many different ways that I've seen organizational structures, and even those organizational structures where it doesn't appear that the library has a seat on the table. That doesn't mean that they're not able to build very strong partnerships where they are able to influence strategy, where they can align their metrics with university metrics. So even if you're not at that dean's table, that doesn't mean that a library can't make the impact that resonates with the university.
Yeah.
I don't know,
Excellent.
Emily, if you've seen something else or see other trends.
I would agree with you. I mean, I was lucky. I was a dean who reported to Jeff. And so I loved it because I felt that we really needed to have purpose and priorities and really think about what we were doing and if it was making a difference. And not only that, but if it did make a difference, making sure that campus leadership knew about that so they could use that information when they were meeting with legislators or citizens, business groups, and some of the communities we served. But unfortunately, I have to say, and just I've worked at a lot of libraries over my career, and it's been mixed. And it's not to say that libraries aren't collecting data and that they're not assessing things. I mean, there are huge assessment initiatives across academic libraries, but I do think we need to look at, are we just capturing this data for ourselves? And I think one of the things is going and talking with your campus administrators to see if it really is answering the questions that they need. The other thing too is I think is being comfortable with showing data that maybe doesn't help. And so I think people like to hide some of those statistics that show maybe usage and something is going down. And while, as we know, libraries have changed and that makes sense, there are other stories that can fill that gap. Or maybe there are things to really look at that and see if it's an isolated incident, or maybe we don't need to put as much staffing towards that. And I think being able to communicate that with leadership is important to demonstrate that you're willing to make tough decisions on those things.
You just heard from Hillary Craiglow, Library Consulting Practice Lead at Attain Partners, Dr. Jeffrey Gold, President of the University of Nebraska System, and Emily McElroy, Vice President of Academic Relations at Taylor & Francis. This series is provided with underwriting support from Taylor & Francis. Remember, if you want to keep up on the latest programming from the Authority File, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter for information on the current and previous month's episode. To subscribe, simply visit choice360.org, click on the newsletter sign-up banner in the top right corner, and select the Choice Podcast Updates option. While you're there, you can also sign up for other newsletters published by Choice. Join us next week when we dig into communication tactics for different stakeholders, including how to compellingly describe what goes on behind the scenes, so to speak, of library services, dispensing with the books on the shelf stereotype to reveal a much broader range of services. We also hear about what motivates the donor class to support library budgets. The Authority File podcast is brought to you every week by a small but extraordinary team, including Choice's advertising manager Pam Marino, digital media producer Sabrina Kofer, and digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.